Hello, members. My name is Megan McCauley, and I am the Director of Membership at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. I'm so pleased to be part of these incredible institutions, and I'm honored to be at the helm of such a devoted membership community. I look forward to meeting you, hopefully very soon and for many years to come. I'd like to thank you, our members, for your continued support. While the museum remains temporarily closed, the generosity you've shown us has truly moved us all, and we are so grateful. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome you to Virtual Bouquets to Art. For 35 consecutive years, we've invited more than 100 local florists to fill our galleries with floral interpretations of artworks in our permanent collection through Bouquets to Art. This year, Bouquets to Art will be taking place virtually, and we're so glad that you've joined us here. We've adapted to the limitations of closure by planning a lineup of live talks like this one. We are also hosting live Facebook talks every day and art activities on our website to bring Bouquets to Art, our most popular event, to life in a new way. We would like to thank our Bouquets to Art 2020 sponsors for their generous support. Please join me in thanking Grand Patron Diane B. Wilsey, Honorary Gala Chair Lorna Meyer Callis, significant support from Dodge & Cox and G2 Insurance, generous support from Sloat Garden Center and Wells Fargo, and additional support provided by the Belvedere Tiburon, East Bay, Hillsborough, Ross, and San Francisco auxiliaries of the Fine Arts Museums. Today we will be speaking with Lauren Palmor, the Assistant Curator of American Art at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, on her favorite floral pieces of art from the American Permanent Collection. Lauren received a Master's of Arts with Merit in the History of Art from the Courtauld Institute of Art in 2009 and a Ph.D. in Art History from the University of Washington in 2016, where her dissertation research addressed questions of ageism in the study of 19th century genre painting. She began working in the American Art Department at the Fine Arts Museums in 2015 after completing pre-doctoral fellowships at Winterthur Museum, Garden Library, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Her previous museum experience also includes roles at the Brooklyn Museum, Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Friar Art Museum. She's contributed to a number of publications, including Revelations, Art from the African American South, Cult of the Machine, Precisionism and American Art, and the forthcoming edited volume, American Art, Collecting and Connoisseurship. She frequently supports institutional digital partnerships, working collaboratively to design new ways of sharing and experiencing American art with museum audiences. And today we get to enjoy that with her. So we're excited to share her enthusiasm and expertise on our American art collection with you today. Please note that there will be a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation based on some previously submitted questions. And without further ado, I'm so glad to introduce Lauren Palmor.
Thank you for that introduction, Megan. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me today. I only wish we could be together in person. My name is Lauren Palmor, and I am the Assistant Curator of American Art at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. I began working at the museums in 2015 while I was still completing my doctorate. At the time, I dreamed of working with a great collection of American art, but I never could have imagined that I would have landed back home in the Bay Area working with the best collection west of the Mississippi. Every day, I learned something new while walking through the American art galleries. Being stuck at home during shelter in place, I really miss those small moments of surprise that grab you as you walk around a museum and feel the energy of the artists through their work. When I was asked to speak for Bouquets to Art this year, I jumped at the opportunity to recreate at least a small part of that feeling of surprise for all of you at home. Although we can't stand in front of these paintings quite yet, I do hope you will return to the museum soon, and perhaps when you do, you will go out of your way to seek out these 5 paintings like they're old friends of yours. Let's get started. I will now share my screen and show you some of my favorite things. Let's get started. I'd like to begin with this quote from the architect and designer Charles Rennie Mackintosh, which inspired the title of my talk. He said, quote, "Art is the flower, life is the green leaf. Let every artist strive to make his flower a beautiful living thing, something that will convince the world that there may be, and there are, things more precious, more beautiful, more lasting than life itself." Mackintosh's statement reminds us that throughout art history, Artists, designers, and artisans have sought to capture the beauty of flowers in order to make them last. Aside from their visual appeal, many floral subjects contain additional layers of symbolism and significance. The American Art Collection at the Young Museum features a number of florals related to artists' adventures, ambition, and inspiration. From personal images of daily life and quiet reflection to global influences and international journeys, a rich variety of these narratives can be found on the gallery walls. I've selected 5 of my favorite floral stories to share with you today as we celebrate Bouquets to Art online. Azaleas and Apple Blossoms is one of about 15 large-scale aesthetic still lifes that Charles Carroll Coleman painted throughout his career. Aesthetic refers to the aesthetic movement of the 1870s and 1880s that manifested itself in literature, art, and design. The aesthetic movement began in Britain and promoted beauty as a virtuous, artistic, and social force, particularly within the home. Aesthetic movement writers, artists, and designers sought to escape the materialism of the Victorian era and reacted against mass production and industrialization. They looked instead to such sources as nature, history, and the arts of Asia. They promoted the idea of art for art's sake, aiming to create works that would be admired primarily for their visual beauty instead of their narrative or moral message. Like many aesthetes, Coleman looked to nature. This still life takes as its subject white azaleas and pink apple blossoms. Some viewers may associate these flowers with impermanence. Both appear only briefly each year, with most azaleas blooming only once annually for about 2 weeks, while the blooms on an apple tree remain in place for 3 to 5 weeks. Both compensate for this brevity with beauty. The subject and inventive, attenuated format of Coleman's composition recalls a Chinese or Japanese hanging scroll, such as this Edo period depiction of white plum blossoms, which offers a striking antecedent for Coleman's still life. Similar design strategies can be seen in these Japanese hanging scrolls from the 18th and 19th centuries, which also depict the spring blossoms of flowering fruit trees in a manner that seems to defy gravity. Coleman's composition is starkly vertical, exaggerating the elongation of the azalea branches that stretch upwards and burst into rapturous clusters. They're presented with the fragile asymmetry of ikebana, the Japanese art of flower arrangement. The ascensional quality of Coleman's composition is counterbalanced by the 2 vessels that seem firmly grounded on the table. The deep red color of the stout Japanese jar contrasts with the white petals of the azaleas, while the pink apple blossoms are set off by the lustrous glaze of the blue and white Chinese vase. The vase recalls the so-called China mania of the 1870s, when Coleman's fellow aesthetes, such as James McNeill Whistler, popularized the taste for collecting blue and white Chinese porcelain in the West. The richly decorated vase in Coleman's work features a deer, a traditional symbol of longevity, offering a stark contrast with the fleeting lifespan of apple blossoms. The tactility of Coleman's flowers recalls the artist's brief time studying in Paris under the great French history painter Thomas Couture, who is represented here by the detail of a floral garland and a red peony from his 1874 painting, Romans During the Decadence. Coleman was respected by his contemporaries as a leading painter of decorative still lifes. Born in Buffalo, New York, he left the United States for Europe after serving in the Union Army during the Civil War. He spent the rest of his life living abroad. He painted azaleas and apple blossoms in Rome, where he resided from the late 1860s through the mid-1880s, and was an active member of the city's creative expatriate community. Coleman's Rome studio became known for its displays of rare and exotic objects and textiles, from antique pottery and Japanese fans to Chinese lacquer bowls and colorful Mayolika vases. This 1884 illustration by George R. Halm shows Coleman's collections of Ottoman and Indian textiles, porcelain, furniture, all confirming that he personally displayed many of the objects featured in his paintings. He even displayed small vases of flowers, which I circled in yellow. Coleman also served as a dealer and agent for other American collectors who are interested in acquiring similar objects for themselves. In all, Coleman created more than 400 paintings and works on paper, reflecting his diverse interests in the arts of China, Japan, the Middle East, and the Italian Renaissance. Passion Flowers, a late work from 1917, venerates the beauty of a Renaissance Maiolica vase spilling over with passiflora, while Quince Blossoms fuses a traditional Western tabletop still life with Asian objects, integrating a Japanese paper fan and Chinese ceramic bowls into the cohesive design of the composition. However, Coleman is probably best known for his series of extraordinary decorative flower panels, created primarily during the late 1870s and 1880s. These works exemplify how aesthetic movement artists inventively combined elements of Western and non-Western culture, engaging in an extended dialogue between the East and West, the past and the present. These compositions may be appreciated in artist-designed frames, which include decorative elements influenced by Italian Renaissance style. Unique in the history of American art, Coleman's still lifes have drawn comparison with the dramatic intensity of stained glass panels by his contemporary, John Lafarge. Lafarge collected Japanese prints and made similar use of gravity-defying Japanese effects in his own work. Coleman's Azaleas and Apple Blossoms, with its captivating mixture of cultural references, confirms the artist's alignment with the international aesthetic movement, which embraced the philosophy of art for art's sake, indulged the pleasure of looking, and promoted the pursuit of beauty in all aspects of life. This pleasure of looking is also central to Martin Johnson Heade's Orchid and Hummingbird, a work that demonstrates the artist's remarkable ability to dramatically blend the tropical landscape with still life. In this relatively compact composition, a sweeping view of a tropical body of water is pushed to the background, giving focus and attention to the dramatic orchid and tiny bird in the foreground. Heade gives preference to the minor over the major, creating a heightened sense of drama and wonder. The practice of pairing flowers with birds had long been established in the history of scientific illustration, as seen in such examples as this 1765 image of Brazilian hummingbirds by the British artist and writer James Forbes. However, Heade's images of birds interacting with dazzling floral varieties are distinguished by the artist's distinctive presentation of this subject set within a realistic landscape. Heade's orchid and hummingbird are not scientific specimens, but living things shown in their natural habitat. Heade was long passionate about hummingbirds, explaining, quote, "A few years after my first appearance in this breathtaking world, I was attacked by the all-absorbing hummingbird craze, and it has never left me since." Heade's dedication to these tropical subjects was confirmed in 1863 when he traveled to Brazil for the first time. He may have been initially encouraged to make this journey by his friend Frederick Edwin Church, who worked in a neighboring studio in the famed 10th Street Studio building in New York City. Church traveled to South America in 1853 and 1857, and sketches from these trips provided a reference for such works as The Heart of the Andes of 1859, one of the most popular paintings of the era. Church's sensational tropical landscapes likely helped inspire Heade's 3 Central and South American adventures. Between 1863 and 1870, Heade traveled to Brazil, Colombia, Panama, and Jamaica. He took copious notes and made precise studies of the tropical scenery, flowers, and birds he saw. For example, the inscription on this landscape identifies the enormous plants in the lower right corner as tree ferns. Heade repurposed his floral studies for compositions that he later completed in the studio, often repeating his use of a study multiple times and using the same flowers from his studies in many finished paintings. Mark Handelman is an artist and professor at Rutgers University. While studying Heade's orchid paintings, he created this digital superimposition of 4 paintings, showing just how Heade used the same flower as the subject of multiple compositions. These rotated frames align all contours of the flower, showing their shifting alignments as Heade reframed and repositioned the same orchid again and again. Heade's studies were part of an ambitious project of his own design, a grand illustrated catalog of hummingbirds entitled The Gems of Brazil, which was never completed. He wanted to document the seemingly endless variety of hummingbirds whose iridescent feathers resembled gems or jewels, and he designed inventive compositions to show these birds in their natural habitats. There are approximately 340 different kinds of hummingbirds, then sometimes called gems or jewels because of their iridescent feathers. Heade's title, The Gems of Brazil, aligns with contemporary descriptions of hummingbirds, like this one from his friend James Cooley Fletcher, who wrote, quote, "In the midst of the foliage, the hummingbird appeared like a piece of lapis lazuli surrounded by emeralds. Everywhere throughout Brazil, this little winged gem abounds." Heade's paintings delighted Brazil's Emperor Dom Pedro II, who knighted him for his artistic achievement. He eventually took the completed pictures to London to work on the chromolithographs and text. However, owing to lack of funds and Heade's own dissatisfaction with the quality of the reproductions, the book was never published. It was during his first trip to Brazil that Heade most likely saw orchids in the wild for the first time. Back in his New York City studio, he began to paint scenes of orchids and hummingbirds together, referencing the many studies he completed abroad. Orchids and Topaz Hummingbird from 1871 is one of the earliest works in the series. When viewed side by side with the de Young picture, one can observe the ways in which Heade sought to refine this new type of composition, working through such considerations as setting, placement, and scale. These works also demonstrate Heade's long-standing interest in the Cattleya orchid, a flower native to Brazil. Cattleya orchids come in a rich variety of colors, from brilliant white to vibrant pink and soft lavender. In nature, they grow high in the rainforest canopy, just under the top layer of foliage. Orchid and Hummingbird features a soft pink Cattleya in amazing detail. It is cast in a light that reveals the delicate flowers and ruffled edges of the petals, and the flower is shown in an ideal state, without a single blemish. At the time when Heade painted this work, orchids were at the center of new theories and debates about evolutionary anatomy in the natural world. In May 1862, about a decade before Heade began the series, Charles Darwin published a book about the fertilization of orchids. He shocked readers by describing the orchid not as a beauty of God's creation, but as part of a family of plants that had evolved to ensure cross-fertilization. Although Heade never explicitly mentioned Darwin in his writings, he was likely familiar with his controversial ideas, which revolutionized popular opinion of orchids. With its emphasis on the functions of sexual reproduction in plant biology, Darwin's book suddenly made these flowers seem outright scandalous. Despite any perceived controversial associations, Heade was entranced by orchids, and he continued to produce these tropical pictures into his later years, ever devoted to these exotic birds and blossoms. These works invite viewers to contemplate Heade's beloved subjects by becoming a companion in nature with the artist. Moving forward through space and time, I'd now like to jump into the 20th century to discuss another one of my favorite floral pictures in the collection, Nikolai Fechin's Flower Girl of 1936. Flower Girl presents a strong example of Fechin's empathetic portraits animated by virtuosic color. He painted thickly with a palette knife, conflating realism and abstraction. Certain specific details are legible, such as the woman's smiling face, while other passages appear as spirited abstractions. In the foreground, the young woman holds bouquets of vibrant flowers, their deep gold and rich violet tones suggestive of daffodils and irises. Fechin's realistic portrait and precise details contrast with the expressive abstract blossoms, creating a dramatic tension and a riot of color. Fechin was praised early in his career for his canvases that were described as, quote, savage, splendid, and heterogeneous. He was born in 1881 in Kazan, Russia. His father was a woodworker who gave him early instruction in drawing and sculpting and encouraged his son to hone his natural talents. He enrolled in a local art school at age 13, and after graduating, he entered the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. At the Imperial Academy, Fechin studied under the realist history painter Ilya Repin and Philippe Meliévin, whose paintings of peasant life were strongly influenced by the French Impressionists and Anders Zorn. In this comparison of works by both artists, one can sense the dueling forces of realism and abstraction that must have been pulsing through the Academy during Fechin's student years. After graduating from the Academy in 1908, Fechin was awarded the Prix de Rome and began to exhibit internationally. In 1910, he was invited to show in the International Exhibition at the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh. There, he caught the attention of American collectors, with whom he remained in touch throughout the First World War and the Russian Revolution. His American supporters long sought to bring his family to the safety of the United States, and after many delays, the Fechins arrived in New York City in August 1923. After 4 years in New York, Fechin developed tuberculosis. His doctors recommended that he move to a drier climate, and in 1927, the Fechins moved to Taos, New Mexico, where they initially rented a house from socialite and patron Mabel Dodge Lewin. He eventually built his own house in Taos, which is now home to a museum dedicated to his life and work. My husband and I visited last year, and it's beautiful, and I highly recommend a visit. In New Mexico, Fechin developed a reputation for his vivid and sensitive portraits of friends and members of the local community. He balanced a realistic and disciplined approach to the figure with a technique that was direct and boundless, verging on the abstract. His practice flourished in the desert, and he found inspiration in the diversity he found there. Sadly, 6 years after settling in Taos, Fechin's marriage collapsed, and he moved to Los Angeles in 1933. He lived there for the rest of his life, teaching art classes in his secluded canyon studio. In 1936, Fechin traveled to Mexico with a small group of his students on a 6-month painting tour of Guadalajara, Mexico City, and Oaxaca, where he met Diego Rivera. One of the students on the Mexico trip later recalled, quote, "The sources of supply for materials were fair only. In the South, nothing. Artists in the area found other supplies for us," end quote. Despite these shortages of art supplies, Fechin sketched constantly and took hundreds of photographs documenting the people he encountered on the trip. And perhaps this smiling flower seller was among them. The background of the composition includes a realistic depiction of a trajinera, a small boat used to carry goods across canals, most often found on the picturesque waterways of Xochimilco in Mexico City. Xochimilco is famous for its canals and its many small boats that have transported people and goods for centuries. Xochimilco's floating gardens, also known as chinampas, are a Mesoamerican agriculture system. These ancient canals, still in use today, were used to cultivate flowers and vegetables for the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Agriculture remains important in Xochimilco. Today, the area is still home to 4 major markets dedicated to plants and flowers. If Fechin was inspired by the sights of Xochimilco during his travels in Mexico City, he was not alone. In the same year he married Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera painted Vendedora de Flores in Xochimilco, honoring the flower sellers to Mexico City. Flower Girl seems to capture the excitement that Fechin may have felt upon seeing this remarkable place, and he captures similar elements of visual appeal that were then being used to market Xochimilco as a tourist destination. His expressive, abstract blossoms recall actual colorful bursts of inspiration, evoking the pleasure he may have experienced on touring the area. Fechin's own creative interpretation of the vendor and her flowers conveys rich emotional associations. The abstract and emotional qualities of Fechin's flowers are echoed by Florine Stettheimer's Still Life with Flowers, which offers a compelling example of the artist's inimitable approach to floral subjects. A confident departure from realism, Still Life with Flowers depicts an arrangement overflowing with fragrant, eye-catching phlox. Phlox come in a wide variety of colors and bloom from July through September, making them a popular feature in summer gardens. In Stettheimer's composition, attention is paid not to the individual flowers, but to the sensation of viewing the bouquet as one joyous, tactile ensemble. Stettheimer painted flowers throughout her life, incorporating them into her figurative compositions or using them as the focal point of her still life paintings. Her friend, the art critic Henry McBride, wrote, quote, her colors instantly forgot they came from the paint box and took on the tints of the flowers. When she painted flowers, she was never literal in her descriptions of them. The blossoms in her vases wriggled upward with a whimsicality in the stems. Stettheimer lived in a rarefied world of beauty and creativity. Born into a wealthy family in Rochester, New York, she was the 4th of 5 children. The family moved comfortably between Europe and the United States, and she received her elementary schooling in Germany. She began her formal art training at the Art Students League in New York City, where she honed a distinct personal style that attests to her exposure to post-impressionism during her family's extensive travels in Europe. She was particularly influenced by the work of Henri Matisse. I think her admiration is made especially clear in this comparison between Matisse's The Joy of Life and Stettheimer's Heat of 1919, one of my favorite paintings of all time. Together with her sisters, Carrie and Heade, Stettheimer socialized with contemporary artists and writers at the exhibitions and intellectual salons they hosted at their grand apartment on 58th Street in New York City. There, the Steadies mingled with such illustrious guests as Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Alfred Stieglitz. The 3 youngest sisters never married, and their family's financial security allowed each to wholly devote herself to artistic pursuits. Florine was a painter, Heade was a writer, and Carrie was a talented miniaturist, whose dollhouse is still on view at the Museum of the City of New York. Now I have to take a sidebar here to mention the dollhouse because it is an incredible treasure of modern art. Many of the Stettheimer's artist friends made tiny copies of their paintings and sculptures for the dollhouse, which is noteworthy for many masterpieces by such artists as Marcel Duchamp, Alexander Archipenko, Marguerite Zorak, George Bellows, and Gaston Lachaise. But I digress. It is really difficult to not get lost in the fascinating lives of the sisters. Because Stettheimer was relieved from the financial pressures of selling her work, her artistic practice remained a private pursuit. She once said, quote, letting people have your paintings is like letting them wear your clothes. For these reasons, her art could be intensely intimate. Her paintings depict family, close friends, favorite places, and dreamlike settings. Appraised as a group, Her work suggests a coded personal mythology. For instance, in this unconventional and personal family portrait, her family members are not only clearly identifiable, but represented in a way that reflects each figure's individual character. In terms of her style, Stettheimer was influenced by diverse artists and cultures. In addition to her appreciation for Matisse, she also admired Japanese prints, Persian miniatures, and early Renaissance paintings, which share an emphasis on the qualities of color, pattern, and rhythm. Her work is also rooted in the European symbolist tradition, and some have observed parallels between her work and that of symbolist painter Odilon Redon. This is particularly clear in the comparison between Stettheimer's Russian Bank of 1921 and Redon's Vase of Flowers, which is in the FAMSF collection. Between her tender portraits and pageants of Manhattan life, Stettheimer painted arresting floral still lifes in her distinctive candy-hued palette. These bouquets have deep biographical significance, as Stettheimer took great pleasure in making arrangements for her own enjoyment. Stettheimer presents interesting evidence of her love for bouquets in her nude self-portrait of 1915, a personal reinterpretation of Titian's Venus of Urbino and Manet's Olympia. Stettheimer's self-portrait is noteworthy due to its status as one of art history's rare nude self-portraits by a woman artist, and, unlike the flowers in Manet's Olympia, which are presented by a maid, Stettheimer's bouquet was likely one that she made herself and gifted to herself. Manet's Olympia is often identified as a work that is central to the birth of modern art. The painting depicts a woman and her maid in a contemporary Paris brothel. Victorine Mouron posed as the titular Olympia, while a woman known only as Laure posed as the maid holding the bouquet of flowers. Although little is known about Laure today, art historian Griselda Pollock has speculated that she was an Afro-Caribbean woman from the colony of Martinique who was either brought or immigrated to Paris in order to work as a servant or a maid. Some art historians believe that Manet likely met Laure while she was working as a nanny, and he went on to paint her multiple times. While earlier art historians frequently oversimplified Laure's role as a racist stereotype, recent scholarship has begun to reappraise her presence as a representation of the complex racial dimensions of modern life in post-abolition Paris. For more on this painting, I highly recommend Denise Morel's book, Posing Modernity, which addresses Laure as a multifaceted and oftentimes contradictory symbol of modernity in her own right. When viewed side by side with Stettheimer's self-portrait, the various complexities of Manet's picture heighten the radical nature of Stettheimer's departure from the script. Olympia works as a courtesan and receives flowers from a woman who works in another circumscribed milieu. Manet's double portrait features two women who both perform labor for others and who would have functioned on the margins of contemporary Paris society. Going back to Stettheimer, her self-portrait shows a woman who works only for herself. Perhaps it is a subtle criticism of Manet's picture. She painted this self-portrait at 44 years old, alone and independent, celebrating herself with a bouquet of flowers she holds in the air. Art historian David Tatham has argued that, quote, by taking the bouquet into her own hands, Stettheimer made herself, compared with Olympia, an emblem of self-sufficiency. Stettheimer enjoyed decorating with flowers as well, surrounding herself with her favorite emblems. Contemporary photographs of her Bryant Park studio show multiple flower arrangements placed throughout the space. Stettheimer's birthday bouquets were particularly noteworthy. Her annual birthday ritual involved picking a bouquet of seasonal flowers, an event that she would note in her journals and paint for posterity. For example, on her 61st birthday in 1932, she painted herself this bouquet of flowers featuring petunias, a cactus dahlia, pom-pom dahlias, and a delphinium. She also included a self-portrait at the lower right, showing herself arranging flowers while wearing high heels. Stettheimer was also a theatrical designer, and some of these floral works include curtain elements, suggesting theatrical performances in the form of bouquets. This use of props and still life staging makes these paintings seem like private theatrical events that the artist choreographed for her own pleasure. Finally, Stettheimer also wrote poetry, often invoking flowers and floral themes in her work. In her poem, Revolt of the Violet, she gives some insight into her empathetic identification of flowers, which she imbues with their own consciousness. I have it up here in her own handwriting, and I'll read it aloud. The poem goes, "This is a vulgar age," sighed the violet. "Why must humans drag us into their silly lives? They treat us as attributes, as symbols, and make us fade, stink." With its varied and rich associations, Still Life with Flowers exemplifies Stettheimer's ability to turn a simple bouquet into something emotional and monumental. Slightly abstracted, her arrangement privileges her own subjectivity and her various intimate associations with the floral theme. It is extravagant and it is personal. The descriptors extravagant and personal might also conjure associations with the flower paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe. Of course, we couldn't talk about flower paintings without talking about O'Keeffe. She was actually friends with the Stettheimer sisters, and she was fond of outgoing Eddie and shy Florine, and the women maintained a correspondence over the years. O'Keeffe's monumental, closely cropped flowers may seem worlds apart from Stettheimer's idiosyncratic and theatrical tabletop still life. However, in the words of curator Georgiana Uljeric, quote, "Both artists shared a revolutionary sense of monumentality as well as a playful seriousness in their approach to their subject matter." Petunias was inspired by a patch of purple flowers that O'Keeffe first planted at Lake George in New York's Adirondack region in the summer of 1925. And this is one of a dozen works of various sizes and perspectives that were inspired by those plants. How did O'Keeffe come to plant flowers at Lake George? O'Keeffe met Alfred Stieglitz in 1916 when she visited his gallery 291 to see an exhibition of works by Marston Hartley. He was an internationally acclaimed photographer with an avant-garde gallery. She was a talented artist and teacher, unknown at 28 years old. Their lives became intertwined. From 1918 to 1934, O'Keeffe made regular visits with Stieglitz to his family's property on Lake George, which became a source of lasting inspiration and her retreat from the bustle of New York City. She typically stayed at Lake George from spring to fall. There she continued to find new subjects while walking around the bucolic setting of the Stieglitz property. She enjoyed spending time on the wooded hillsides and hiking up Prospect Mountain to take in the spectacular views of the lake. At Lake George, O'Keeffe also found abundant orchards and flower beds. Still life subjects were all around her, literally ripe for picking. She collected flowers, fruits, and leaves that caught her eye, and she painted still lifes exploring these organic forms. She was particularly drawn to the shapes of apples. As Stieglitz wrote in one letter, quote, "She has the apple fever." O'Keeffe befriended the chief gardener, Donald Davidson, who was also known to some as Mr. Flower. In Davidson, O'Keeffe found a like-minded person who was also interested in the smallest natural details of the Lake George landscape. They would spend hours gardening together, tending fruit trees and flower beds. Together, O'Keeffe and Davidson also selected plants for the property. Petunias may signal the influence of Luther Burbank's dramatically illustrated seed catalogs, which they consulted together while choosing plants for the orchards and gardens. In this work, O'Keeffe's magnified flowers fill the canvas without directional orientation, each petal animated with velvety textures and crisp contours. Featuring 6 blossoms posed at different angles and at various stages of blooming, it evokes the movement of a single flower through space and time. O'Keeffe's central petunia is presented facing directly forward. The flowers are arranged against an ambiguous monochrome background, much like Burbank photographs. The composition also reminds me of Van Dyck's portrait of King Charles I in 3 positions. This unusual portrait, which depicts the king from 3 angles, aimed to give the fullest and most useful descriptive view of its subject, and it was sent to Rome to be used as a reference work for the sculptor Bernini, who was planning to create a marble bust of the king. Van Dyck was interested in capturing different views of the same subject at the same time. And O'Keeffe's flowers can be similarly read as a portrait of a single flower shown from a variety of angles. However, O'Keeffe's petunias can also be interpreted as a chronological study, showing the progress of a single purple petunia as it blooms. The magnification of the flowers can also be linked with the practice of photographer Paul Strand, who was a close personal friend and a fellow member of Stieglitz's circle. Strand's earlier works, such as this still life, may have had some influence on O'Keeffe's own compositional strategies. Coincidentally, just as O'Keeffe embarked on her still life experiments at Lake George, Strand was working on his own radical still lifes while staying at his family's summer cottage in Connecticut. The 2 artists had first met in 1917, and O'Keeffe later confided in the photographer, quote, "I believe I've been looking at things and seeing them as I thought you might photograph them. Isn't that funny? Making Strand photographs for myself in my head." Of course, O'Keeffe's achievements in this mode were singular. Inspired in part by Lake George and her personal experiences and friendships, these paintings came from a desire to share her way of seeing nature. In the 1930s, she wrote of her desire to paint the humble flower enlarged and up close. She wrote, "I'll paint it big, and they will be surprised into taking time to look at it. I will make even busy New Yorkers take time to see what I see of flowers." Thank you so much for joining me today as we celebrate bouquets to art. I hope you've enjoyed spending some time with some of my favorite floral pictures in the collection. I've certainly missed them over the past few months. I look forward to seeing you back at the De Young when we reopen. And in the meantime, thank you, and please continue to enjoy bouquets to art online.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that wonderful in-depth presentation on the stories behind some of your most beloved floral paintings. I feel like we not only got to go back to the museum, but we also got to spend a little time outside, which is really special these days, so thank you. All right, so I have a few questions that were previously submitted. So the first question here is, can you speak to some of the nuances and differences between the female subjects and flowers when painted by a female artist, sort of like Stettheimer, and a male artist like Fechin?
Sure. I wish I had more time to speak about this today, but I think it's important to remember that early on, there was a hierarchy in the arts, and there were limits on what men were expected to paint and expectations about what was good art and what were the most important themes. And there were guidelines about what women were supposed to paint and in what media. So while men were supposed to aim for history painting and paintings of religious themes that were intended to be painted in oils, women were limited, and it was deemed more suitable for genteel or refined women to work in watercolors and to paint things like flowers or domestic subjects, things they'd find around the home, as the home was really a woman's world. So I think because of all of this historical baggage we have in art history, when you see a work like O'Keeffe's Petunias, to see a subject that was deemed small and insignificant and worthy of a woman's artistic attention, when O'Keeffe blows it up and demands you to look at it as if it's as important as a history painting or a religious scene, I think it's a very subversive and radical idea that we might only appreciate once we remember that there were a lot more limits on what women were expected to paint and how they were allowed to paint centuries ago. So she was radical in her own time, but she's also radical when you stand her up against all art history.
All right, for the next question. Are there contemporary artists who you think are doing interesting work related to the depiction of flowers now?
Yes, absolutely. Flowers have been a popular theme since people began making art. when we evolved as an artistic species, and I think we'll always be returning to flowers for inspiration and as a source of new ideas. In terms of contemporary artists, personally, just speaking as Lauren Palmor and not as a curator at the museums, I really admire the work of Jonas Wood. And I think what's really exciting and interesting about his work, which often flattens and abstracts plants and flowers and vases, he takes this language as still life. But on top of that, there's this very rich personal dimension because he is married to the ceramicist Shio Kusaka, and she makes a lot of the vessels that are featured in those still lifes. So to see these very subtle portraits of an artist's relationship within kind of an abstract and joyful composition, I think is very moving and rich. And I can't think of a lot of still life painters who work with flowers with that additional dimension of the personal relationship. I also was really over the moon when I learned that Heade Wiley's portrait of President Obama really drew on the rich language of flowers. I have a personal interest in the language of flowers, which was really popular during the Victorian period. And everyone was equipped with this kind of coded language that allowed you to send messages and share secrets through arrangements of flowers. Each one had a special significance. And it's fallen out of favor. Floral dictionaries are not as popular as they used to be. They used to be something that every person would have. But when I learned that Heade Wiley, I mean, it's a beautiful portrait with Obama alone, but then when you learn that the flowers were selected to tell stories behind the president, jasmine to represent his birthplace and his childhood home in Hawaii, chrysanthemums, the flower of Chicago, African blue lilies to celebrate his father's Kenyan roots, I found that really moving as someone who sees a lot of value in understanding these secret languages of flowers that sometimes I think we tend to forget. There's also a lot of exciting stuff happening in photography, and I would recommend anyone who loves Dutch still lifes or who liked some of the still lifes I spoke about today, they might want to look at the work of photographer Sharon Core, who explores truth and illusion in floral still life photography that quotes from the history of Western still life painting. So that's a few. It's hard to pick.
Amazing. No, I'm sure people will be writing those down and looking them up. I know I'll be taking a closer look at some of those works as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
And speaking of, so the Dutch artists are really well known for these elaborate, beautiful floral still lifes, and French as well. So I'm curious, one of our questions is, can you please talk about the influence of French and Dutch still life paintings on American artists' depictions of flowers?
Yes. I think a great place to begin answering this question is with the work of Raphael Peale, who I'm sorry I didn't speak about him today because we have his famous painting of blackberries in our collection at the de Young Museum, painted around 1813. And Peale is recognized as perhaps the first great master of still life painting in the United States, a son of Charles Willson Peale, the important artist and museologist. And what's really exciting, to draw a connection to the question, is Peale was living and working in Philadelphia around the same time that the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts was first doing exhibitions featuring great European still lifes. And there are records of Spanish, Dutch, French still lifes being exhibited in 1810. And when you think about what would have been involved in bringing a Dutch still life to Philadelphia in the first decade of the 19th century, it makes you appreciate just how important it must have felt for people to see those works and share those works. So Peale was, of course, directly influenced by those works. And then as the first great celebrated still life painter in this nation, he distilled those traditions into something that then became distinctly American. But there's a straight line from older traditions to Peale, to Jonas Wood and Heade Wiley and everything I mentioned in my contemporary answer. And I think that's very inspiring.
It's amazing how we don't spend as much time thinking about what an effort, like what a Herculean effort it would have been to transport a work like that, when now we can so easily access images online, which, while not as special as seeing them in person, is certainly something not to take for granted. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm.
And our last question here is, why is Nikolai Fechin in the American art collection if he was born in Russia? Is he considered an American artist?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are so lucky in the American Art Department because we get to include the work of any artist that considers themselves American. And we don't have codes or guidelines for how someone qualifies. I think it does. Someone lands in the American art galleries if they lived in the United States, if they taught in the United States, if they spent time here, if a work was painted here and it was significantly impacted by their presence in the United States. For Fechin, I think there's no question that he belongs in our collection. He came in 1923, he died in California in 1955. That's 32 years living, working, and teaching in the US, contributing to the development of art in the United States. He taught so many people. He was part of the cultural confluence in Taos, New Mexico, which is, that's a lecture all on its own. So I'm so lucky because as an art historian, I feel quite greedy. I love a little bit of everything, and I love learning from diverse experiences. And as an American art historian, I get to eat from a much larger buffet, as you could say. So we're very lucky that people who consider themselves American, worked here, taught here, we get to be very inclusive.
Well, I feel like we've heard at least two more very promising potential future conversations from you about the cultural confluence in New Mexico, maybe something someday about the secret language of flowers. I just have to say, Lauren, thank you so much for preparing this talk for us. And hopefully everyone at home will join me in giving you a round of applause, and you can sort of imagine what it might sound like. But we're so grateful for your time and expertise. So thank you, Lauren Palmor.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And thank you all of our members who are with us, for attending Art is the Flower, Floral Stories from the American Art Collection with Lauren Palmor. Bouquets to art in and out of our galleries would not be possible without the support of our loyal members and donors. So thank you all so much. We humbly ask that if you enjoyed today's talk, please consider going above and beyond and making a gift to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco in any amount that you feel is appropriate. Every gift made helps make programs like this accessible and supports our efforts as we prepare to welcome you back. Don't forget to tune in to tomorrow's live bouquet building workshop with Charla Flock of Bloom Tuesday, as well as our other shorter live chats that we're offering all week on our Facebook page. Please head to our website to see the schedule of events. Thank you all, and be well. Take good care.